Okay, I feel like I need to get a good start on 2023 by finally getting around to some of the video topics I keep putting off. And I've had some good feedback so far on videos I've done on the topic of the Shin Gunto. So hopefully you're going to see more of that soon. But for today, I wanted to take you back through my video catalog and my personal history and give you a closer look at one of my two original antique Type 98s. Specifically, the first one I bought for myself all the way back in 1980 for the purpose of training with. Now, if you've seen some of those early videos, you've seen it featured, but you have not seen it in its original traditional fixtures. And I did explain the reason for that. It's had a hard life. Starting from, well, when I bought it, I was looking for my first shinken, my first nihonto, my first traditionally made clay-tempered sword for training. But I was on a college student ramen diet budget, and also the only things available in my area were, well, war prizes, Gunto. But I did manage to find a collector, and he had something in my price range that was beat up, rusted, chipped, scuffed. Saya was dented and crushed. Tsuka was damaged. But that actually was in my favor, not just for the price, but because I was intending to use the sword. I was worried about getting something that had antique value that I might ruin. Well, this was certainly beyond ruination. Now, if you're familiar with the antique community, you know that restoring something like that often diminishes its antique historic value. It's better, as they say, to preserve the old rust than to put a new polish on something. Well, guess what I was going to do, and guess what I did? Took it home, painstakingly restored it, taught myself how to restore it. And apparently I did a good enough job that when that collector saw that sword a year or so later, he really felt like I ripped him off. Trained with it hard and frequently, and in my youth, I admit, abusively and probably irresponsibly. But it held up amazingly well. 10 years later, about 1990, I'm still training with it, and the Ito, which had been lacquered, spontaneously disintegrated in my hand. And then the tsuka core, which I patched and repatched, split in about 5-6 different places, and I was basically holding a bundle of big toothpicks around that Nakago. Thankfully, no flying sword massacres, but tragic, heartbreaking. So I had to make myself a new tsuka core. Now, I've been training with Uchigatana with longer tsuka, so I decided I'd try a 12-inch tsuka. I didn't have access to ray skin, so I found some nice dragon pattern silk brocade and kind of made it look tachi-like. And I also was liking a leather Ito at the time, so I wrapped it in leather. While I was at it, I went ahead and did the same thing to the saya, kind of made it look a little bit like a tachi, and then continued to train with it. Now, as I've been collecting reproductions, those reproductions have taken over that role. That's one of the things I've talked about in those review videos. It's one of the reasons why I purchased them, is so they can take the hard use and my old antiques can kind of semi-retire. They still come off the shelf, they still get trained with, but I'm not going to put them the same kind of abusive use that I used to. But here I am thinking, maybe I should attempt to restore that sword to its original regulation appearance. So I figured, okay, well, I've got all the hardware. I'm just going to need a new tsuka core and new ray skin and new Ito. And I'm going to need to undo what I did to the saya. That's the easy part. Tsuka core, ray skin, wait, maybe not. Going through my old parts boxes, and I did find all of the fragments, splinters of that original tsuka core. And I did not document this well because I was certain it would be a complete, frustrating failure. But I slowly but surely filled it, glued it, laminated it all back together. And there were about 5 or 6 fractures all the way through it, plus the The Makugiana, the holes for the Makugi had been stripped out, one as much as half an inch. So that needed to be filled and reinforced. Didn't think I was going to be able to do it. But lo and behold, I got it all together and it was solid. Okay, now I need some new race skin. I was about to order some when I found, yes indeed, the original fragments of the full wrap race skin. Okay, can I save this too? I cleaned it, soaked it, got it supple again. Stretched it over the tsuka core, had to patch a couple of holes in it, and okay, now I started taking pictures because now I was kind of feeling good about this. Slipped it back onto the Nakago and it fit like a glove. Okay, now the only thing I need to do is rewrap it. Bought some Ito, and the result, yeah. All right, well, I'm pretty pleased with it. Let's go ahead now and take a look at this sword and make a couple comparisons. This particular example, again, it's not necessarily representative of all Gunto, compared to some of the reproductions that I've acquired. All right, I'm going to treat this a bit like one of my sword reviews, and we'll start with specs, fit, finish. I'll make some comparisons to some modern reproductions, and yeah, we'll talk about handling in that comparison. But let's start with the edge. Now, this blade, especially compared to modern reproduction Japanese style swords, has an incredible amount of meat. It is far more axe-like than knife-like by design. But let's see how this old edge handles some paper. Okay. Not a razor blade, but hey, it's sharp. How about a little bit of cardboard just for fun? I got some hands sitting right here. Yep, it'll shave some cardboard. Yeah, it's still got it. Okay, let's talk about the stats of the sword, and I'll make a couple of comparisons to modern reproductions to put it in context. And yes, I'll look down at my notes so I can give you the metric as well as the imperial units. Starting with the blade, Shinogi Tsukiri profile, no bohi, fairly short kasaki, and it does have still the vestiges of a geometric yakote on it, but blade length measured from the habaki is 26.5 inches. 66.67 centimeters, which is going to sound a little bit short for you collectors of modern reproductions. Those tend to run 27, 28 inches, but they're designed for the Western buyer's market. Historic examples, and not just Gunto, but also Uchigatana, tend to be a bit shorter than that. 25, 26 inches is pretty common. Now, Sori is a little bit more extreme than the average Uchigatana, especially modern reproductions, but not as intense as, say, a Tachi, drawing a straight line from the tip to the base of the habaki, and then measuring the highest point in that curve, 7/8 of an inch, or 2.22 centimeters. With the blade at the base, 1.25 inches, which is pretty common for Japanese style swords, so that's about 3.17 centimeters. Distal taper, not very profound. Starts down here at 5/16, about 8 millimeters, goes down to about 1/4 inch, so about 6 millimeters, a little bit more than 6 millimeters. We'll talk about balance and weight here in a second, but tsuka is 9.75 inches, so about 24 centimeters. Common for Gunto, Uchigatana, you're probably thinking with modern reproductions, 11, 12 inches, but it's something I'm used to. This is right in the standard range. Now you'll notice that the curvature is also present in the tsuka, so it's continued in the tsuka. That gives it a feeling of having more sori. It's also tapered. Now, we'll talk about fit, finish, and stuff like that, but we need to talk about the weight balance. For my reproductions with this blade profile, and their blades are a little bit longer, I usually expect them to be about 2 pounds 4 ounces. This one is 2 pounds 11, so 1,219 grams. Point of balance I tend to expect being about 3 3/4 inches. This is at 4.5, so about 11.5 centimeters. So yeah, that's something to consider when it comes to how it feels, how it handles, the weight and the point of balance being heavier and further forward in the point of balance than a lot of my other reproductions. Well, let's talk about my attempts to quantify how a sword feels in hand by giving it what I call a tip score. I've described this in previous videos, that for Japanese style swords, my sweet dividing line is a score of 8. Anything a little over an 8 probably feels kind of heavy in the blade, makes for a good cutter, but maybe not as quick. Anything a little less than an 8, we're talking about half a point to a full point, is going to be lighter in hand and therefore quicker, easier to maneuver, faster. Probably better if you are practicing kata or iaido, or you're a beginner just starting out, or an arthritic old man like me who wants to take it easy. This blade scores an 11. So yeah, it feels massive in the hand in terms of weight and authority. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. First, I want to talk about fit and finish. All right, we'll talk about the fit and finish of the saya as we transition into the handling section. Wanted to talk about the sword first. You'll see I'm wearing a different color shirt because when I got to editing, I didn't like any of these clips because I feel like we need to have a separate discussion on the topic of sword steels and forging processes in historic Shin Gunto. So look out for that video coming soon, I promise. But starting on the friendly end, if you've purchased a reproduction or are planning to, the bad news is if you want to match the casting quality of the original fittings, you're probably going to have to get a more expensive one, because for fittings that were mass-produced for military issue weapons, they did a phenomenal job. Detailed, crisp, and no seams anywhere, and that includes on the saya. Now, these fittings have held up to a lot of wear and tear and hand oils and repolishing. There was some damage that came with the sword, and some damage I did. So we'll start down here with the Tachi style Kabutegane pommel, which is made out of copper. You'll notice at the end it's squished. That was all me. In my stupid youth training tsuka ate, using this as an impact weapon, I was striking targets I probably shouldn't have been striking with, well, copper. So yes, it deformed kind of badly. But it hasn't broken, hasn't fractured, it's held together. Now, damage that came with the weapon, sarate lanyard loop missing, long gone. Also the grommets, that hole goes all the way through the tsuka core. There were some brass grommets in there, they were also gone. Replaced the lanyard loop with just something I made out of brass rod. I will probably replace the grommets, I'll just make some new ones out of some brass tubing. I've done that on other swords. Interesting detail though, the ito goes through the bottom of the pommel, doesn't stop below. Gives it a little extra retention. However, this is a pommel design that you can, really secure down firmly on a tsuka core. Like I said, I've hit a lot of hard things stupidly and repeatedly with this. Yeah, has not come loose. Now, Minuki. 3 cherry blossom design, which is common across Gunto, in the original palm position. As compared to under the fingers, which you might see on a lot of uchigatana or modern reproductions. The Fuchi has the hole in it for the scabbard lock, which was broken when I got it. I just took it off. I didn't have a means to repair it. Unfortunately left a fatal flaw in the tsuka core because that spring had a slot cut all the way down, almost all the way to the single makugi pin. and a single pin that's traditional for this design, and it's held up just fine, except for this one moment where, as it started to wear with that aging wood and the use and abuse I was putting it to, once it started to stretch and strip out, it broke all the way into that empty space. Yeah, that was pretty catastrophic. I plugged it many, many years ago with a solid block of bamboo that's held just fine since. Ito originally had hishigame, full wrap same underneath it, and it also originally had, I don't know what it's called, the fine strips of wood, almost paper thin on either side. I didn't bother to replace those. Let's talk a little bit about the Nakago. It's a 2/3 length, which is, again, traditional, not only in Gunto, but in traditional Japanese swords. Show some pictures of it. Really nice file work. Has the Showa stamp that says it was made during that period specifically to be a Gunto. And we'll talk about the different manufacturing processes. Nice tool marks, nice file marks. It is signed on one side. Now, I managed to translate enough of it to know that it was made in Mino. But as for the smith's name, well, you got a couple of problems. One is they tend to use a flowing script, at least some of the smiths, which is a lot like cursive writing in English, plus being a signature. Think of what a lot of people's signatures look like. I've had experts look at it, and they have not been able to translate the smith's name. I'll put up some pictures, and maybe some of you can help me out with that, but there's always hope. On the other side, there were the remnants of some painted characters that usually indicate when it was made, but they were so worn away that they could not be read. The people who've looked at this sword, the experts, the collector I bought it from, estimate it was probably made sometime in the 1940s, but can't be sure. All right, moving up. Now, as the Makugi hole had stripped out as that wood aged, I did stack more seppa in there. Since I rebuilt it, it's back to its original fit and configuration of having 4 seppa, 2 kind of regular shaped ones, and they do have the hole through for the spring catch. And then underneath them, a pair of winged seppa that match the motif of the tsuba. And the tsuba is in the very traditional Shin Gunto cherry blossom pattern. The habaki, copper, nice lines, nice grain pattern, very crisp. It's certainly taken some wear and tear and staining and abuse over the years, but incredibly well fit. The blade, again, we're going to have another discussion about steels and forging, and there's a lot of things I don't know about this sword, but I know what it's been able to do for me. It's been a very strong, hard, resilient blade that I've done some stupid things with, and it's survived. Now, I did hand polish it when I got it because it was scratched and scuffed and chipped and corroded. Did I do it in a traditional fashion? No, but I did it gently using very, very mild abrasives by hand, not by machine. Now, when I treat the sword with a mild vinegar lemon juice solution, it does bring out a saguha, a straight hamon. So it is clay tempered, and that edge has been performing at a 60 HRC or above. Really, really hard edge. Now, Shinogi Zukiri profile, lines are pretty crisp. It does still, after all the polishing and repolishing, again, non-traditional, still has the vestiges of a geometric yokote. It is a short kasaki, which is held up to a lot of abuse. Peaked spine. Everything in terms of the planes are pretty well done. Like I said, a lot of meat, so those edge planes have some convexness to them, much more hatchet-like than knife-like in profile. All right, let's talk about the saya, talk about handling. All right, speaking of the saya, I do intend to do a video on Gunto hangers versus tachi hangers versus other swords. The hangers. The 98 has a single ashi designed to usually be hung by one loop, and you'll notice what it does is it hangs fairly vertically at the hip, Now there was a secondary, what they call a barrel hanger. There was a chain that kind of wrapped off the belt and caught the scabbard down here. But I don't want to get one of those because I feel like that would definitely chew up the finish. But I have designed one made out of leather that, again, I'll demonstrate in the other video, that gives this sword more of the double hanger stability. But a lot of the officers didn't like this because, yeah, it's kind of flopping around. Now, one thing you can do with it, which is cool, is flip it backwards out of your way. So that's one option it has. But otherwise, yeah, this is not a favorite way to do things. So I'm going to go ahead and take it off the hook and do what most Japanese officers did, which is just go ahead and put it through the belt and use the ashi as kind of the retention right there, kind of as your kuragata, yes? And then you could use something to create a sageo if you wanted to. But now I can pretty much use it like an uchigatana, yes, in terms of being able to draw it. However, you are dealing with a metal scabbard, so it's a lot heavier than you might be used to. Has fittings that have a tachi sort of presentation to them that match the rest of the theme. Usually has a greenish, like an olive green or brown. I went ahead and, since I've repainted this thing about 50 times, I've gone with a black theme just because it appeals to me. The koiguchi matches the fuchi. They have screws that actually hold the kojiri and the koiguchi in. So just little screws that hold those. And yes, these are fully wood lined. Now the interesting thing about the full wood liner is that it feels like it gives a lot of cushioning and shock absorbing to the blade. Drawing and resheathing is really just incredibly smooth. Plus, since I have a metal saya, I'm not terribly worried about banging it up like I would with a nicely lacquered wood one, right? Nor am I likely to break it. I have had to, pop some dents out of it over the years, but yeah, this is a very sturdy presentation. It is slimmer this way, and again, a lot heavier than you might be used to. But being solid and heavy, could you use it as a secondary weapon? It's a good question. Maybe we'll talk about that in future videos. When it comes to drawing it, not only does it, you can adjust the retention by actually adjusting that liner. I'll talk about that in another video. But because it is so smooth and a slightly shorter blade, drawing, despite its weight, can be really quick, especially in smaller spaces. Now, resheathing it doing noto, because you have a brass koiguchi, it takes a little getting used to. And it feels like it might abuse the sword finish, but it doesn't. At least it hasn't for me in all of these decades. So, not a bad thing, and it does give you a koiguchi that's really hard to damage. You're not likely to have those accidents that could wind up splitting a saya. So that's all good. What about the sword itself? All right, this is already getting probably pretty long, so I'll keep the handling section down to a minimum, and I promise I'll cover more Gunto content in future videos here soon. But I've already kind of covered the major points. It is a slightly shorter blade with a bit more of a curve than you might be used to if you're used to an uchigatana, especially a modern reproduction, with shorter tsuka, and you've got issues I've discussed in previous videos about that kabutogane pommel and having to get used to that and avoid those hot spots. But you have to remember, this is the primary sword that I trained with, starting from 1980 through, well, until I really started acquiring reproductions that I preferred better, which was 20 plus years later. So yeah, this has been my primary sword for the longest time. That and my other antique that we'll look at in another video. And now that I've gotten into reproductions, I feel a little bit spoiled. Not only do I have a variety of shapes and curves and things like that, swords that are better at cutting through soft targets because they're more like razors, but I didn't realize what I was working against in terms of weight and balance for the longest time. And I think that probably was really good for my physical training. But having a sword that is, well, several ounces heavier than what a lot of people might be training with, but also a lot further forward. Now, I've mentioned that I practice both one-handed and two-handed. And one-handed, I would say the equivalent to this would probably remind you of a heavy cavalry saber if you study HEMA or something like that. So it is very saber-like. It is something that you can make good, powerful, strong cuts with one hand, but quick reversal of direction, momentum, that's going to be tough. You're going to do a lot more cutting through than you do short, quick action. So it's not going to be a fine maneuvering weapon that way as compared to a lighter blade. Two hands, well, you get the same kind of issues. You do have a sword that has a bit more curve, and that plays into, we've talked about this in other videos, and I'll probably talk about it in the future. Makes thrusting a bit more of a challenge, a bit more saber-like there in the thrust. They do tend to go more around corners than in straight lines. So I had to get used to that. You do have a short Kasaki, so it's not a super fine needle tip, which is actually good. It's really hard to damage. I have, as I mentioned, used the tsuka as a weapon as well. Probably not the smartest thing to do, but the arts that I study practice that. I tried to see what I could do, and the sword paid for it, unfortunately. But yeah, I've had to get used to using a blade that is heavier, more blade forward, and in my youth that was probably really good for me. But if I ever slacked on my practice, I ever got out of shape trying to pick this thing up again, oh yeah, it would let me know. But it has been a solid partner with a lot of character. And I've had to patch it up and repair it over and over and over again, but I've managed to keep it together pretty well, and I'm pretty pleased with my ability to restore it to something that looks pretty original. I don't do the best wrapping jobs, I fully admit that. All right, so hopefully you're still with me. If you have any questions about this sword or other comparisons to any reproductions you might have or be interested in, let's get our conversation going in the comments. Promise I'll have more content. I'll do another video about my other original here shortly. And as always, thanks for watching, subscribing, liking the videos, following my journey. And I do hope to see you back for, well, whatever's coming next in 2023.